So by way of introduction, my name is Joshua Schmidt. I teach 6th through 8th math in McCook Central in Salem, South Dakota. This is my 5th year of teaching. All of my resources and everything that I do in my classroom is posted on my website, which is right there on the top. This presentation is on the website, along with a today's meet if you wanted to do any back channel conversations as we go through it. I also am on Twitter. I use that almost exclusively for professional developments and presentations like this. So if you have any questions, you can always get a hold of me on Twitter. And then, of course, email is the best way to communicate with me. In fact, since my students have class today, I'm probably going to have about 40 emails by the end of this presentation with questions from students. I do have to admit, though, that I feel rather underqualified to be up here. I'm simply a 5th year teacher. This is something that I've been doing really in the last 4 years. But I feel like this stage presents me as someone who has it figured out. And that's very not true. I'm a long ways away from where I'm hoping to go. This presentation is seeking to be an open and honest view into the progress of my classroom, where I'm hoping to go, and then if other teachers or schools are interested in the same method, maybe some steps and ideas that they can take. But I don't want to present myself as the expert on this. So moving on to my, if I can get this to work. Yep. Something always doesn't work right away. Here we go. So the goals for today, I have 3 of them. First of all, I want to talk about what is customized learning and how do I define it. There's a lot of different terms for customized learning, personal learning plans and things like that, and they're all basically the same. And I want to really talk about what the tenets of each of them are. I want to show what customized learning looks like specifically in my classroom and the things that I've done with my students, which means a lot of the examples are going to be math-based. Rather than look at the specific technologies and softwares that I've used, think about the ideas of why I chose those technologies in the first place and ways that you can make them work in your classroom. And then finally, I want to give some tips and ideas about how you could customize your school or classroom tomorrow. I want these to be very specific and real world. So moving on to the definition of customized learning, I define customized learning as leveling material for students, or each student every day. And each student every day is probably the most important part. You're not targeting the top, you're not targeting the bottom, you're targeting everybody. That doesn't mean you're going to be successful every day, but that is the goal. And as long as you're trying to reach every student every day, then you're trying to customize your classroom. The 3 main parts that that's split into is appropriate leveling, the idea that every student is going to be learning the most challenging material that they're able to do each day. Independent pacing, and that's the thing that I focus on more than anything else. I want my students to be able to progress at their own speed. And then, of course, authentic student choices, which is probably the hardest thing to do, because by its nature, giving students authentic student choices means that teachers have to do more lesson planning, or you have to collaborate with other teachers so that you can try to take that workload off. So we're going to start with what is customized learning and really where did I get to, or where am I at and how did I get there. So in my first year of teaching, I grew up in South Dakota. I graduated from Lenox, South Dakota. My mom teaches in Parker. I graduated from SDSU, and then I went to teach in Salem. I have the same story that most teachers do from South Dakota, that this is my home, this is where I've been my entire life. That also means, though, that my first year of teaching, I taught the way that I was taught. You know, the way that my teachers taught me in middle school and high school, the way that my college professors told me to teach, and the way that I saw other teachers teaching at the time. It meant that every day was an independent lesson. I would stand up in front of the room for 30 to 35 minutes, depending on the topic, and then I would give my students a little bit of work time, but most of it went home with them, which meant that I was not necessarily a teacher, I was a lecturer. I was a provider of information. And I want to talk about 4 types of students that I saw in my classroom and why I eventually switched to the model that I have now. The first student is Emily, and every classroom has a few Emilys. As soon as I ask a question, Emily wants to answer it before I'm done speaking. If I don't call on Emily right away, she raises her hand so violently that it looks like her shoulder will dislocate. And if another student gets to answer, she pouts and then won't answer another question for 5 minutes. I can't take credit for the Emilys in my classroom. They're going to learn independent of me. My job for Emily's is to get out of their way, give them the resources that they need to learn, and just help them and supplement when they need the assistance. But if I give a test, my Emily's are going to do well. If I give a project, my Emily's are going to do well. Because the thing that matters more than that student's intelligence is their motivation. And as long as they have high motivation, they will succeed. Now, Emily's are a very positive influence in my classroom. You know, when I ask a question, they want to answer it. When I give a project, they're the first one to step up. If they're in a group, they will always pull their own weight. Until you think about the student that sits next to Emily, which is Anthony. Every question that Emily answers is a question Anthony doesn't have to. If Emily and Anthony are in a group together, Anthony doesn't have to do any work. And as long as that cognitive difficulty is being taken away from this student, they will never improve. My classroom model is not about getting that student to turn them into an Emily. It's about to get a little bit more than I currently get. I tell my students on day one, my job is not to make you love math, it's to make you hate it a little bit less. And with this student specifically, that's the goal. And I can say with honesty, now that I teach in a customized environment, so far this year, all of my assignments except for one has been turned in and at a proficient level. Even my Anthony's eventually get their work done. And it's important to compare that back to that one-size-fits-all classroom because I would get nothing from them. And now I at least get something. Two more types of students that from the front of the room look very similar. We have Adam and we have Brandon. Both of these are very technologically advanced students. I had a hook with them during my first year of teaching because I used a lot of technology, so they were immediately on my team. The problem with Adam and Brandon is that they switch roles every day. That one day, I walk behind Brandon and he's working on his homework. He asks me a few questions when I'm nearby. He's really pushing himself to try to achieve. And then I walk behind Adam and he's playing plumber's crack on his iPad. He also is distracting every student around him. Just because these students look the same from the front of the classroom doesn't mean that they are the same all the time. These students rely very heavily on motivation because whatever they want to do is what they're going to do. And my job is to try to get that thing they want to do to be mathematics. And it doesn't work every day, but it definitely works sometimes. Technology is always a big in with these kids. Allowing them to bring their own devices into the classroom is immediately a benefit. And so at the end of my first year, I tried to evaluate my own teaching. And what I saw was that I was teaching these students the same material, the same way, and in the same amount of time. And the reality is that they need 4 vastly different learning experiences in order for them to succeed. And when they are together, they are detrimental to each other. The Emilys in my classroom do not help the Anthonys. The Adams and the Brandons are not helpful to each other because they usually get each other off task. I needed an environment that allowed those students to be at their appropriate pace and going their appropriate speed before I was ever able to make any progress. I would hope that you guys ask yourself the same questions that I asked myself at the end of my first year. The first of which is, why do I teach this material this way? The answer to that should be really simple. It should be, this is the best thing for my students today, and that's why I teach this way. But I answered this question by saying, well, that's the way I was taught. That's the way that I learned to teach. I maybe don't have enough time to do a better version of this, or I haven't found a better version of this. And I'm not saying that that's horrible if you're a teacher who answers that question that way, but you're also trying to solve the wrong problem. Until your answer is, this is the best thing for my students, you're never going to be able to reach that final goal. And so I still don't make this every day. I don't do the best possible example every day, but that is always my goal. And I don't allow myself to have the excuse of, well, this is the way that I was taught. If I don't have a better idea yet, I go find one. If I don't know a good project, I go ask a better teacher, someone who has a better idea than I do. The second part of this is, what is the most valuable part of my class period? My class period is basically spent with me talking. This is an unusual experience for me because this is the most I've talked in front of a room in 4 years. And that is a big jump for me to go from someone who talks for 35 minutes to someone who just kind of sits around and waits for a student to ask me a question. Some days that means I'm kind of just in the way. And then there are other days when I have 18 kids who have 18 questions all at the same time. But you have to be malleable in order to look at the most valuable part of your class period and then amplify that strength that you have. I also looked at my Emilys and I asked myself, am I limiting them? And I found out very quickly that I was. As soon as I allowed that student to move at their own pace, they moved 10 times faster than I ever would have, which meant that I was slowing them down. And I also found out when I looked at my Anthonys that when I allowed them to move at their own pace and I actually got some motivation out of them, it meant that they went slower than I was going in my classroom pace. And if there's anything that you remember from this presentation, I hope it's the next slide. What does my dream classroom look like? And this is what I had to really sit down and decide. Imagine for a second that you have infinite resources. You have the infinite amount of money. You have every computer program or textbook you could ever want, and you have every little technological piece in your classroom you could ever dream of. You have infinite support from parents, from teachers, from administration. Everyone is going to be behind you 100%. And then, of course, you have infinite student motivation. Whatever you choose to do, your students are going to be 100% on board. What would you do with that? What would your classroom look like? And for me, I found out that the classroom that I currently had constructed did not look like my dream classroom. And I'm not advocating for you to step in tomorrow and change everything that you do. But I'm hoping that you can identify what your perfect classroom environment would be and then take any baby step that you can to get just a little bit closer. Baby steps can be huge improvements, especially because I'm someone who's been working 4 years, and I would say I'm not really halfway to this goal yet. It's a process that takes a substantial amount of time. So, I decided at the end of this process that I wanted my students to move at their own pace. When I talked about customized learning, I split it into 3 parts: independent pacing, appropriate leveling, and then student choice. Moving at their own pace is my number 1, 2, and 3 priority, which means that if I ever have issues that come in conflict with each other, I'm going to choose the independent pacing. Everyone in this room is going to have a different opinion on that most important part, and that's good. And your classroom then is going to look very different than mine has. So please keep this in mind as I start to look through some of the pieces of my classroom, that this was my number 1, 2, and 3 priority. The first thing I did is I identified lecture as my weakness. I'm not saying that lecture is horrible in every classroom, but it was the worst part of mine. So I had to find a way to replace it. I used videos, and for about half a year I used a flipped model, which means that my students every day after school watched a video, and then in class time they would then do their homework, and it failed miserably. If you watched Ramsey's presentation yesterday, he really outlined the reasons why a flipped model doesn't work if you don't take other pieces into consideration, and I found many of those same things. The students who don't do homework don't watch the video. And that's part of the issue. The students who need to watch the video don't, and the students who don't really need the video spend too much time on it. And it ends up not being beneficial for both my top and my bottom end of the spectrum. But what I did find out is that the most important part of my class period was the work time. Allowing students to simply work on material for 45 minutes was much better than sending it home with them. And there are pieces of a curriculum that students can do independently. I'm not saying homework is a problem, but for me, I had all of that cognitive difficulty being done when I wasn't in the room. And so by just simply moving that into the classroom, I saw some major benefits. The other thing that happened is my Emilys came to me after like the first day and said, can we work ahead? I put all this material on my website, the videos were available for them with assignments, and I said, sure, go ahead, see what happens. They came back to me at the end of the week and they had finished an entire chapter, which was about 11 sections. And I had no more material for them. And this is something that's important to identify with teachers. If you're thinking about doing independent pacing, you can't go back from it. As soon as you let your top-level students work ahead, they won't let you pull them back to the group, and they shouldn't. And so for me, I didn't really think independent pacing was a possibility. My students forced me to do it, and I had no choice after that point. I just had to make everything else independently paced. I also moved into a website, and I don't want to go too much into specific websites because there are so many options out there, and I think if you really want to look at specific options, you can simply Google how to make a website. I use Wikispace. I use the term low barrier of entry, which simply means I want the technology that takes the least amount of time for me to learn, and so I picked Wikispace. Wikispace is a white background with font and links, and that's it. There's nothing else that goes on a Wikispace, and that was great for me. It meant my students could easily find the material they were looking for, and there was not a lot of confusion. If you wanted some more powerful website options, that is something that you could look for as well. The other thing about my website I want to point out, if you go to my website, the only thing that's linked there is stuff I allow students to do outside of the classroom. So it doesn't include everything. In fact, there is a lot of material that students can't get except from me, and that's because I don't want students starting a project, getting 30 minutes into it, and doing it completely wrong. So there's quite a bit of material that's not linked on the website. Google Drive, which I'm sure that has been brought up in nearly every session over the last couple of days, is amazing. And I do pretty much every assignment through Google Drive, and so I don't want to get too detailed into this, but I do want to talk about why I think it's a good tool, which is simply there's no saving, so students can't come to you and say that their computer blue screened and they lost everything. That was my number one piece. The classroom extends everywhere. We're on a school network, so if my students save something to the school network, they can't get it at home. Google Drive allows them to access that information everywhere and on any platform. And then, of course, collaboration is really easy. Multiple students can work on the same document. I love it because my students can't finish assignments until I've decided that it's a proficient level, which means I use the comments inside of Google Drive and Google Docs to comment on things that are incorrect and need to be improved, even when students aren't in class. If I lost Google Drive, I would be a mess, because everything that my students do is located on here somewhere. And then I needed a tool that allowed self-grading. Because as I talked about before, when you start to give your students authentic choices, it basically means that instead of having one possibility, they could have three. And that means that I have to be prepared to grade those three things instantly. When my students hand in an assignment, they need to know if that assignment is completed, because it tells them if they're allowed to move on. So it has to be instant. I wanted to choose a tool that helped me with that grading process. Now, I think that every teacher is going to pick a different one, and I listed just a bunch of options. You need to find the one that works for what your classroom is seeking to do. I wanted a software that students could easily work at home and be told if they were right or wrong. That was my goal, so I picked IExcel, and that's what I use right now. IExcel is not necessarily the solution, but it's better than the problem. And so that kind of evolves every year. If you talk to me next year, I might use something totally different. Every year it kind of changes. So at this point, I realized that I had created a hyper-efficient model that was basically the same as what I had done before. My one-size-fits-all classroom was now just faster. I use that and I call it the train. I had made a faster train. My students were able to progress through the material sometimes 40% quicker just because lecture was removed and they could do assignments at any time, any place. I would argue, though, that that's not the solution we should be trying to reach. There are some schools and some teachers who that is their end goal, to allow students to get to every AP class possible to then finish. But as a middle school teacher, that's not necessarily something that's sustainable because it doesn't exist in my high school. If I send my students to 9th grade math with 10th grade math ability, I'm not actually helping anybody. There's not a system in place. So I want to be a helicopter. I want to get off the tracks completely. My students are going to go deeper into the material, they're going to go off in left field for a while, but they're eventually going to end up in the same place. So that's why I have those. I'd say let's make a helicopter, not a faster train. I do want to say, though, that especially if you're a teacher who's on your own, a helicopter is a much better option here. If you are a school who is looking to do this completely for all of your classes, the structure might be in place to allow your students to progress through material simply quicker. But you have to decide that on your own and in your own situation. And this is really talking to administrators specifically, especially if you are looking at this is something that you want your teachers to do. Customized learning is not a textbook. You can't buy the Customized Learning Aligned textbook and then be a customized teacher. It's also not something that you can buy. If you buy IExcel or you buy a subscription to 10 Marks or you do any of those things, that doesn't make your classroom customized. Customization is a tool that is over-encompassing. It's also not something you can learn in a day or probably even a year. I'm on year 4 and I still have a lot of growth that I need to make. And then also it's not easy. It's definitely hard. But as I tell my middle schoolers, the most worthwhile things in life are hard, and they should be. And I would believe that this is a better way to teach. This is a better way for students to learn, but there is some great difficulty that comes along with it. But I do want to make a caveat with this. Customized learning is an entirely new way of thinking about a curriculum, but customized learning uses things that good teachers already do. If you're a teacher who's really good at lecture, keep lecture. If you're a teacher who has really good, authentic, real-world projects, keep them. Find the things in your classroom that can be improved, and then use customization to improve them. But I'm not expecting anyone to reinvent the wheel or take everything that they've done and remove it. One of the things I say to teachers, if you're looking to start, just add options. Keep the content that you already have and just add choices for kids within that content and see what they do with it. Simply give them some resource that allows them to work at their own pace and see what happens. Your kids might be ready for it and some might not. For my 6th graders right now, I have 2 students out of 19 who are working ahead, which seems like then it's a failure of that independent pacing, but I would argue that's awesome because those 2 students are getting what they need. And maybe the other 17 are prepared for like the classroom speed and all at the same level. But those 2 kids are still benefiting from the system. And the only person who's really getting punished about that is me, because I had to do the work to get them to that place. Whereas other classes, like my 8th graders, everyone's off in different places all the time. So. This is where I want to start looking at what can technology help me do better. And I want to, real quick, I'm not advocating for or against any of these specific softwares. I'm hoping that the question that you look at here is what types of technologies should you be looking for? And I'm using 3 very math-specific examples and then talking about which of these examples would be best for certain classroom environments. The first one I want to talk about is 10 Marks by Amazon. 10 Marks is a very visual medium that focuses on the underlying knowledge of content. So when students answer a question, it's not about the answer, it's about why that answer is correct. If a student gets this answer wrong, they then can watch a video or get a hint and then correct it. I, as a teacher, at the end of this process, don't see how many problems they got wrong on the first try. I only see the end result. Okay? The other one is IExcel, which I use more often. IExcel is, first of all, it's pay only. That's a big difference between 10 Marks and IExcel. But IExcel only cares about the answer. So if my students answer a question, all I see as a teacher is, was it correct or was it incorrect? How much time did they take on the problem? That's it. There's no other piece to that. If a student gets it wrong, they don't get to correct it. They don't get to fix it. And that's all IExcel does. IExcel is also not very visual. Most IExcel problems are just simply as if you stole them out of a textbook, and then sometimes they give a multiple choice, sometimes they type them in. But it's a very minimalistic software. And then, of course, probably my new favorite technology is called Mangawhai, which is a game-based website where students level themselves inside of the game. So if 2 students play the same game, this is Flowerpower, if they play it for 30 minutes, the 2 students could cover totally different sections of material based upon their own leveling. Mangawhai is very generic in the skills that it covers, but it automatically levels itself, and it has a little bit more motivation because it's actually a game. So the question becomes, which is best. And the problem with customization is that the answer is almost always, it depends. It depends on your kids, it depends on your classroom, it depends on your administration, and it depends on your parents. There is no clear-cut answer. Using any of these three technologies would be best in certain situations. And so what I usually do is I just offer all of them. Rather than try to pick myself, I kind of let my kids choose for me. And kids are really good about that, trying to scout for which is the easiest possible problem that they can do. So I try really hard to make sure the difficulty of the sections is equivalent. The first question is, what do you need that technology to do? I needed something that my students could easily do at home when they weren't in school, because with the textbook, when students brought that textbook back to me, they would sometimes have 0 out of 15 correct, and that was the end of that process. And IExcel doesn't allow that to happen, so that's what I picked. If you're looking for a different tool, then you should pick a different software. How comfortable are you and your students with the specific software? That barrier of entry is something I talked about earlier. How complicated is the software to use? Someone talked about, I don't remember who it was specifically, talked about passwords, and having to remember 50 different passwords can be difficult. So maybe if it connects to a different technology, that might be better. How much responsibility are your students prepared to handle? I have groups that I will kind of just let them go, and then I check them once a week to kind of make sure that they're hitting their pacing like they're supposed to. And I have groups that I check every day at the beginning of class. Each situation is going to be different, each kid is different, and each classroom is going to be different. And then how difficult is it to stay organized with your students being independently paced? Spoiler, it's really hard, and it's always really hard. I talk about later my horrible sense of organization that I have with these tools. It's just really tough because instead of having one specific thing that's being graded, you can have an infinite number. And what does student choice look like? So this is really the last part of customization. We covered the independent pacing, we covered the leveling that was inside of it, and now student choice is probably the most ambiguous. Inside of student choice, and this is a stolen idea, I didn't come up with this myself, is the concept of trivial student choices versus authentic student choices, and I am probably the biggest offender of this. My first year of teaching, I told students you can pick book assignment A or book assignment B, and I asked them to pick, and I thought that I was giving my students a choice. But it's a trivial choice, it's a false choice, it's kind of a trick, right? You're trying to ask them which of these has more story problems in it, and then pick the other one. Authentic choices are options where students feel invested in their own learning. Now, if you give students powerful options and they don't feel invested, you still have taken the step forward. It's about the process of choice and then finding the right choices inside of that envelope. And another one is, are textbooks and programs like IExcel different enough to be authentic choices? So my second year, said you can do a book assignment or an IExcel, and I thought that was a big step forward. And it kind of is. I'm not saying that that is a bad stepping stone, but it's also not the goal. Because if you're still focusing on the drill and kill, the procedural knowledge, you're not actually giving the students any authentic choice inside of that process at all. It's simply get the number of questions correct so you can move on. And then baby steps can be giant improvements, definitely. Taking one step towards that dream classroom. Something that I've started doing this year is called a menu. And the concept of a menu is that I split them into 3 parts. I call them appetizers, entrees, and desserts. Students have to get a certain number of points inside of each column of the menu before they're able to move on. So in my appetizer, they had to get 6 total points. In my entree, they had to get 7. And then in my dessert, they had to get 2. And if you notice, they're kind of set up in a way that makes them do about 3 or 4 in each of the options. So this was about a 2-week unit that we covered. There are a couple big difficulties with a menu. First of all, it requires a massive amount of preparation. When I created this menu, I created some options that kids never picked. The dice rolling I called the Yahtzee game, and no one picked it because no one knew what Yahtzee was. So then I had to change the name to dice rolling, and I got 1 kid to pick it. So I spent about an hour and a half creating a lesson that 1 kid did. And that happens a lot. and it's just part of the process. It's something that you as a teacher just have to be willing to accept because of all the other benefits you get from it. If you notice in here, there's a lot of games, a lot of mini projects, there's some creation. Basically, any type of learning that I could think of, I wanted to include it into the menu. The other part of a menu that's really nice is that I could easily collaborate with another teacher to simply just add more options. You don't need to limit any of these choices. So if I doubled the number of choices inside of the menu for the kid functionally stays the same by doubling the options that they can work through. Grading can be extremely tricky on these because you have to create a model that says you're not done until you're done, which means that kids, for me, all end with a B or above. And I have to find a different way to grade them on that. So I have different methods a lot that deal with pacing to try to reach that grading. We are still on an A, B, C, D scale. And I tell my kids that 20% of your grade flat off the top is effort. And it kind of just has to be. There's not really a good way to function inside of that. My students love Tagboard. So if I ever give them an option of doing anything on Tagboard, that's like their first choice. They jump at it right away. So these are replacements for like IExcels or book assignments or that standard learning procedure. That's like my outside wall. And there's huge pieces of paper that are on the other sides of the wall as well. I believe very strongly if students do something in my classroom, I want to show people outside to create some more ownership. The thing on the top right is called a show me how. It's kind of like a teaching opportunity. A kid is proving mastery by teaching it to another student. And then the bottom is something a student did on Google Drive. We had to add fractions that had unlike denominators. Instead of answering questions, they wanted to solve it visually to prove why you had to find a common denominator, so they used Google Drive to do that. I would argue all of these create the same level of mastery as an IExcel or a book assignment, and sometimes more. And from the student perspective, these are way harder, but more interesting. And then rethinking the textbook, I'm going to cross my fingers that this works. This is a project that we took from Dan Meyer called Graphing Stories. And the idea is that you create 15-second videos and then you graph the actions that existed in the videos. So my students split into groups, each made their own video and then shared them with each other, in which they then had to answer the graphing that existed in there correctly using independent, dependent variables, all that stuff. This is directly comparable to this textbook problem that shows graph 1, graph 2, and graph 3, which of these matches each story. Now, once again, I would argue that students are gaining the same level of content knowledge at the end of this process, but my students were way into the graphing stories, and so I got a higher level of motivation, so I probably got a higher level of mastery at the end result. That motivation, that question of can we do this on Minecraft, is worthwhile in and of itself. You don't have to necessarily trick the kids into motivation. Another example is this is a story problem. In a textbook, I cut out the story, but the basic idea here is they want the kids to solve it using a proportion and cross multiplication. Okay? Then I can present them an IExcel problem that does roughly the same thing but gives them a little bit more information. Instead, my students decided they wanted to create an action figure of themselves. And they used a scale factor to scale themselves down. They then showed the correct measurements, and then they made a chart on the back to show that they were correct. I would argue that I would rather have the student on the right. Maybe they don't have the same procedural skills that the students on the left do, but they could surely get the same answer. My motivation is going to be substantially higher with the project. And so that brings me to the last big portion, is what are the weaknesses of a customized environment? And I talked about a few of them already, so some of these might have been talked about before. The first big one is that defining a customized environment can be really hard. The example I gave earlier about a teacher who has a really, really good, authentic, real-world project. My favorite project that we do is called the Planets Project, where we build a scale model of the solar system on 15 feet of paper. The kids love it. It takes like 3 weeks, and it's really authentic. But there's not very much independent pacing. There's not a lot of leveling that exists inside of it, and there's very little student choice compared to my other options. So is this customized learning? Kind of. And that's okay. Like if you walk into a teacher's room and they're doing an awesome project, that's okay if that doesn't necessarily fit the standard model of customization. In fact, my students took a break from my linear pacing to do this project, and it was kind of a refresher for them. You can mix and match your types of content to try to get that student motivation at the maximum level. And I really talk about that student motivation can burn out. Your students, your Emilys, who work as quickly as they possibly can, will not work that quick forever. Eventually, they'll figure out that there's always more content. There's not an end goal. And so having something like this for them as a reward is worthwhile in and of itself. So, defining customized learning can be very tricky, but you don't necessarily have to always define it. The thing right on the bottom part that I'm really careful about is buzzwords. My students don't hear the word customization. They don't hear the words independent pacing. If you walk into my class, they just call it math, and that's just what they're used to. I don't want it to be in a situation where the buzzword becomes the idea. Now, when you hear also terms like personalized learning plans and things like that, they all mean the same thing, which is another danger of buzzwords, that you alienate sections of the same group of people by using different terminology. So if you use any of these ideas, you can call them whatever you want. They all mean the same thing. The idea is trying to reach every kid every day. Students can gain less procedural knowledge. That's a fact, and at some point, you have to admit to that. That's a process. So here is a problem that got cut off a little bit, but it's a problem that could show up on a standardized test, and probably will in 7th or 8th grade. My students don't do this problem. Instead, they do it on Minecraft, where they build a pyramid that I don't even remember the name of. This was substantially above what I was expecting the students to do. I wanted them to build like a rectangular prism and then just do that. And instead, students wanted to build these really complicated, over-the-top projects that were, frankly, amazing and a lot better. This student specifically found out what actual Minecraft blocks, what the scale factor of them is, and then broke that down as a scale factor. He even was able to explain to me at the end of the project why it wasn't perfectly correct and in what places he would have had to change it, which is awesome. This was such an amazing project. If that student saw that problem on the right, he would get the right answer, but he would not do it the way the book wants him to solve it. And while that is a weakness, it's a weakness that I'm glad to have. I like students who are problem solvers and critical thinkers. They can get those skills for free along the way. If I send them to high school as a student who is responsible, who is in charge of their own learning, they'll figure everything else out. And one of the arguments I've always heard is, well, what happens when these kids are in a lecture-based environment? They'll probably do great, honestly. They'll be the kid that by halfway through the lecture, they've figured out what the assignment's going to be, and they're already thinking of types of problems that they then have to solve. If this student takes a standardized test, my students told me that, well, it's just like what we do in class. It's fine. And that was a big deal to me because I've never had students who said that before. The standardized test was always the hardest thing they've ever done. And this year they were like, well, at least we didn't have to build anything. And I was talking earlier about organization being a weakness of mine. You have to find a way to stay organized in this model, and it is really hard. There are some softwares out there that can really help. I personally do it on paper. If you notice in the bottom left, I walk around with a sheet of paper that has probably 60 listed possible assignments on it. So when a student tells me that this assignment is done and need to be graded, I put a little check mark, and then at the end of the day, I go and check each of those check marks. It's not the best model, but it's the best one that I've come up with so far. I also do have a minimum speed because I do teach in a standard school that I'm really the only independently paced teacher, so I need to have it look like my students are progressing at the normal pace. Plus, having a minimum speed makes communicating with parents substantially easier. In a perfect environment, I would let students go 100% at the pace that they wanted to go, but that's not the world that I currently live in, so I need to have some type of compensation between that one-size-fits-all environment and a fully independently paced environment. The way I do that is a minimum speed. Many of my students are nowhere near the minimum speed, which is great. This is really only for your Anthonys and maybe your Adams, okay? Teachers do have to find or create most of their own content, so time is something that this takes, and it's not something you can do in a year. If you're looking to customize, don't customize everything. Customize one project or one small unit, somewhere in a place that you can easily pop back out of it back to a regular paced classroom environment. One of the things I've seen is using a menu is a really good starting point because everyone ends the menu at the same point, and it also forces you to create choices. Teaching failure. I had a conversation with a teacher about 3 months ago where they said, my students don't want to try. You know, I did this and they're just like, it's too hard, I don't want to do it. How do I teach them to do that? And I said, you don't give them a choice. They just have to. And in my classroom, my Anthonys, you know, when they want to sit there and do nothing, it's just not an option. But I think that's more of a classroom management issue than it's necessarily an issue of the customized environment. And I think that as long as you view that as a classroom management issue, you can teach failure in that way. Also, when kids do a project, they need to get used to the idea that it's not going to be right. You're going to have to make corrections. And I think that's a very real-world skill. I try to model that by, I make mistakes every single day. I give out candy when kids find spelling errors on projects and things like that. And I have students who get, 10 pieces of candy in a day because I'm not a very good speller. Also, when technology is involved, you need plans B, C, D, E, F, all the way down the line. It's not going to work right away. That's just the nature of what technology is, especially when it comes to software. There are going to be situations where it didn't work as planned and you gotta have the backup plan, and sometimes the backup to the backup plan. I also talk about students are impatient. This entire model happened because I had students who wanted to work ahead and they just didn't let me slow them down. I make content at the pace that my students go, which means most of the time at the end of the week, I have 8 things that I need to create by the beginning of the next week so my students have enough material for them. My students are the ones that push me to go faster. And that's a benefit of I never had that in a one-size-fits-all classroom before. And then my very last slide here is what are some resources that I can use tomorrow. We did a book study on the book Inevitable that was written by Chuck Schwanz and B. McGarvey. I was doing this, and we did the book study after I'd been doing this model for about a year, and it was amazing just to hear some of the terminology that was used, and then also the ideas. This is a very big picture book, and it was benefit for me to kind of see what the end result could be. Like, what is the actual goal of what I'm trying to do? So the book was very beneficial. I would love to be a resource. I'm not selling anything, except please email me. I want to collaborate with as many people as possible, especially because it's South Dakota. Sometimes we feel like we're on an island and we're kind of by ourselves. And this presentation is a way for me to try to just get people to collaborate with me and to get some ideas. Especially for math and science people, Ramsey, who talked yesterday, his TED Talk is just amazing. It's so, so good. And then Dan Meyer did a TED Talk for math specifically about getting rid of the textbook and rethinking mathematics. Really, really good. And then just find other teachers. Take risks, collaborate, and it probably won't work on the first try, but that's okay because what does your dream classroom look like? If you had infinite support, infinite resources, and infinite student motivation, what would you do with that? Thank you.